Jacob's truck had dropped a drive shaft, so I had to work on that. And then Tiffany's redoing her kitchen, and she had fired her contractor, and so there was a lot of things that had to be completed around the house as well. And so he's trying to get that up. And so we got that, did a lot of work on the place. Wednesday afternoon, she was baking pies, and I've got my head stuck up underneath the sink, putting all the sink in, installing it. So she's stepping over me as she's baking pies. But it was good. And for those of you who knew Sarah Baker, used to go to Northside, she says hi to everybody. Her and her family came over Thanksgiving night, and we had pies and got to talk a lot and play some games together with her family. So she says hi. Plans. How many of us make plans for one thing or another? 2 weeks ago, I shared this sign with you that I have here in the front. I told you that I had found it at a thrift store a month ago. And if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And it made me think, and I bought it because that to me was a good sermon. And I'm going to present that to you this morning. But how many of us make plans? I mean, when I think back at it, I started making plans probably when I was a preteen. I know our daughters did. When they went on Sunday afternoon, they wanted to go over to a friend's house or have a friend come over to to our house. They were making plans. When you become a teenager, you start thinking of, not at your age, but you start thinking of what are you going to do on Friday night and your friends, who are you going to be with? When I was in high school, we used to all get together and go to the local mall, to the arcade, and play games all night. Then you go to college and, you're making plans for your future. And what you're going to be and what studies to take. And then you become married and you start making plans for having a family maybe, or where you're going to live and what you're going to do. And then as you have kids, you're constantly making plans. What you're going to do for the weekend, where you're going to spend your spring break. When Victoria, for her senior year, we took her to Victoria, BC, kind of obvious, and then we took the 101 down the coast. But you're always making plans and doing this and that, and when you start making, sometimes you make plans, for your life and what you're going to be doing. I've known people who had to have their whole life dictated and what it was they were going to do and how they were going to do it and what path they were going to take. Maybe sometimes you're making a plan to go, on a 2-week vacation during the summer, and you sit down on, internet and you make all these plans of what sites you're going to see and what route you're going to take and what hotels you're going to go to, what restaurants you're going to eat. But what happens when, the day before you leave, you blow the transmission in your vehicle, and you can't make that trip that you've been planning. We've had a friend from college who's been planning for the last 2 years to take a cruise this past summer. But of course, all the cruise ships are anchored, so they had to cancel those plans that they've been making for 2 years. What do we do when life happens and we can't complete the plans that we had been planning on for so long? And that's what this is about, You make these plans, but then God steps in. He knocks on your door, and he says, you know what? I've got something else that I want you to do. How do we handle that? How do we deal with those changes that God brings about in our lives? We need to be able to accept God's plan for us without a doubt. Because this is something that God has chosen you to do. We need to be able to do that. We need to do it without fear, without doubt, without selfishness, and without a second thought. God tells you to jump and you ask how high. He tells you to go and you ask him where to. If God tells you to do this or to do that, you should reply, yes, Lord, please send me. God has a plan for each and every one of us. The question is, are you ready? The first person that I want to look at this morning is Noah. God had a plan for Noah. Now, nowhere in the Bible does it state what Noah was doing up until this time. Noah lived 500 years when God came up, knocks on his door, and says, Noah, I've got something I need for you to do. So for 500 years, Noah has lived a life. Bible doesn't tell us what that was. He doesn't tell us about his family life. But Noah was living a life. You know, for 500 years, he's been cruising along with no problems when God comes up and knocks on his door and says, I need you to do something for me. In Genesis 5, verse 32, we read that Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begot his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And I didn't think about it until I literally looked at the scripture that says he was 500 years old when he had his 3 sons. It doesn't say he was 500 when he had Shem, and he was 501 when he had Ham, and 503 when he had Japheth. He said he was 500, and that kind of leads me to believe maybe they were triplets, you know, because he was 500 when he had his sons. Doesn't matter, okay? But he was 500 years old when he had his children. Imagine that. Imagine being that old and having 3 boys. Okay? But what did Noah do? We don't know, like I said, that much about Noah, but there's one thing that we do know, that in Genesis 6, verse 8, Noah found grace in the sight of the Lord. Whatever Noah was doing, it was right. And he found grace in the sight of the Lord. But the thing is that the way Noah was living his life, he was the type of person that God wanted to repopulate the earth. In Genesis 6, starting in verses 13 through 15, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And this is how you will make it. And in the next few verses, God gives Noah kind of a blueprint of how to build the ark. It's how wide and how long and how tall. They're supposed to have 3 stories, and each story is to have individual rooms for the animals to live in. They're supposed to have 1 door and 1 window. And Noah goes about to build this ark. It's supposed to be out of gopher wood. But how did Noah handle God's demand? Here he is, 500 years old, living his own life. God says, I want you to do this. We don't know. I've heard stories or read things, and they say that he was in a desert, that that area never got much rain, probably never saw a boat maybe, didn't know what a boat was. But God comes to him and says, Noah, I need you to build this. And how did Noah take it? In chapter 6, verse 22, thus Noah did. So he did, according to all that God had commanded him. He didn't make excuses. He didn't say, what? I'm supposed to build, what is this thing? I'm supposed to do what with all these animals? No. God saw Noah, knew what he was capable of doing, and Noah did. How long did it take Noah to build the ark? We don't know. He was 500 when he had his kids. He was 600 when it started raining. Okay? So somewhere around 100 years, maybe 80, if you take into effect that his kids getting up and getting married. So 80, 100 years it took Noah to build this ark. Every day of his life. Doesn't matter what he was doing 500 years up to this point. He had to put that on hold because God had given him something else to do. How many of us today would be willing to put the life that we have today on hold, maybe even forget about it, to do something that God wants you to do instead? You want to make God laugh? Tell him your plans. He's got different plans maybe for you. So Noah builds the ark. God brings all the animals to him. They load it up. They close the door. It starts raining for 40 days and 40 nights nonstop. And then here in chapter 6, verse 6, Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters were on the earth. And the rest of chapter 6 talks about the flood and everything that was happening. And then Genesis 8, verse 1, then God remembered Noah. I read that and kind of chuckled. Oh yeah, Noah and the animals. God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. So let's do a little bit of math. Now it's 601 years, day and a month. It was 600 when it started raining. And I don't know about you, I've never really thought about it. I've just always thought, well, maybe it would just rain for, a couple of months and then it dried up and Noah came out. But when you look at it, and I did some research, this comes up with about 370 days they were in the ark. A year. Imagine being in an ark filled with animals. You can't open the door, you can't open the window for 1 year. Tending to these animals, whatever that tending was. Some people say they might have gone to sleep, like we call hibernation. We don't know. It doesn't go into that. But he still had to tend the ark and live in this ark, closed up, with all these animals and his family for 1 year. This is what God had Noah to do. This was now Noah's life. But how did Noah deal with it? Did he complain? Did he gripe? No. In verse 20, when they got out of the ark, Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar, and the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. So being shut up in this ark for a year, his life totally changed. He comes out of the ark, and the first thing he does is build an altar and thank God. Now remember, he totally destroyed the world. God was so upset that he regretted making man, that it was that violent, that within 6 chapters of creating the earth, he was so mad with it that he destroyed everything. That the world was covered with water over its highest peak, which would be Mount Everest, for a year. Talk about a cleansing. But now Noah, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, and all the animals are going to start a new earth. That was God's plan for Noah. Noah accepted God's plan without a doubt. Can you do that today? Could you be a Noah if that's what God wanted you to do? We need to be able to accept God's plan for us, even if you don't understand how it's going to happen, how it's going to come about. We flip over a few chapters to Genesis 15, starting in verse 1. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram, who will later, God will change his name to Abraham, in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward." Now, what has happened before this was Abram's son Lot had been captured, and he had taken his men, about 300 men, and had gone and captured his son back. Okay? And the king was wanting to reward Abram, and he said, "No, I don't want you to reward me. Then people say that you made me rich." And so this is what this conversation comes down to. Verse 2, but Abram said, Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Then Abram said, look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir. And behold, the word of God, or the Lord came to me, saying, this one shall not be your heir, but one will come from your own body shall be your heir. Then he brought him from outside and said, look now toward heaven, and count the stars, if you are able to number them. And God said to him, so shall your descendants be. God is blessing Abraham, and he's telling him that your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars in heaven. And I'm sure you have gone out at night and you've looked up at the stars. Have you ever tried to count them? It's impossible. There's just too many of them. And that's what the descendants of Abraham was going to be. And then we go over to chapter 18, verses 17 through 19. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? And this is dealing with Sodom and Gomorrah. God has decided that he's going to destroy them. Again, when he destroyed the world with Noah, he created the rainbow. And that rainbow was our symbol saying that I will no longer destroy the world again with water. The next time is going to be with fire, as we read in the New Testament. So Sodom and Gomorrah, they're so sexually wrong that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And this is what he's talking about here. Shall I hide it from Abraham what I'm going to do? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he was spoken to me. And you see that Abraham has ruled his house in a worthy way. His children and his whole household keep the way of the Lord, and they do it in righteousness and justice before God. Then going on to chapter 22, verses 1 through 3. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. And he said, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Then he said, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, the son that the world is going to be blessed with, the son that's going to give you as many descendants as the stars in the heaven. Take this only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Abraham, take your only son and offer him on the altar as a burnt offering. Think about that. Let that set in. What God has told Abraham to do. So what does Abraham do? Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey. Did Abraham complain? Did Abraham question it? No, he got up the next morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. But Isaac, his son, spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father? And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire, the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide. God is not going to ask us to do something and to go somewhere and do something and not provide us with what it is that we need. God is always going to give us what we need to do what it is that he wants us to. He didn't go to Noah and said, build a boat. God gave him the explicit instructions on what to do, what wood to use, how to seal it. God gave him what he needed. And you might look at it when God tells you to do something and you say, "No, I can't do that, Lord." No, you can on your own. But God is going to give you what you need to be able to do what it is he wants you to do. God will provide for himself the lamb of the burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Verse 9, then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there, and he placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Do you see where Isaac kicked and screamed and ran away? Saying, "I'm sorry, you're not doing this, not to me." Remember, Abraham had raised his family to be righteous. Isaac understood. God has told his dad to do this, then fine. He allowed himself to be tied and put on that altar. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." So he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham didn't understand it. All of the world's going to be blessed through me, but yet you're telling me to offer my only son on this altar. I don't understand it, Lord, but I'm going to do what you told me to do. We have to have that same faith. We have to have that same understanding. Be willing to do what it is that God has told us to do without question. He knows what's going on. We don't. He knows what he wants us to do. And as we're going to see in the rest of these scriptures this morning and the rest of the stories, and I hope you don't get offended by me calling them stories. That's what we always refer to them as. Sometimes I think when I refer to them as stories, we think of them as being make-believe or, fiction. And that's what we always refer to them as. But it's real life events that occurred in our history that brought us to where we are today. But when we look at the rest of these scriptures this morning, I want us to look at it. What it is that God wanted. The guys didn't understand what was happening, but they did it anyway. Well, for the most part. Abraham accepted God's plan, even though he didn't understand how. God made this promise, but he's wanting me to offer my son. I don't understand it, but I'm going to do what God asked me to do. God will provide, as he did. He provided him with a ram for his offering. We need to accept God's plan for you, even if you don't think that you are worthy. How many of us think sometimes that we're not worthy to do something? Maybe we think that we're not a strong enough Christian to do this or to do that. If God tells you to do something, he thinks you are worthy. In Exodus 3, and the Lord said, "I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt," talking about the children of Israel. And he's talking to Moses here. "And have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, therefore, I will send you," talking to Moses, "to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." But Moses said to him, "Who am I? I'm a shepherd. I'm not a big leader." Why are you picking on me, Lord? I'm sure there's somebody else who is better at this. I'm sure there is somebody else who could do a better job. I've got my life planned over here with my wife and my father-in-law and sheep. He's promised me land. He's promised me sheep. He's promised me a life. Pick somebody else, Lord. How many times do we do that? I'm not worthy. I've done it. I've shared with you the story with preteen camp. We had an announcement that they were looking for counselors at preteen camp. And it's like, you know what? That's something I could do. I've never done it before. I went to camp a couple of years. My kids, were going to camp. I could do that. And so I called up the director and I said, I'll come help you. And he said, okay, I need you to head up the sporting events. And then I got to thinking about it, and I talked myself out of it. And 2 weeks later, I called him back. I said, made up some lame excuse. I'm not going to be able to do it. And I backed out. But God had a plan for me. He needed me to do this. And I felt bad about it. And so I called him back up, and I said, I'm sorry, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to help you with preteen camp. He said, great. Not only do I need you to be head of the sports, but I need you to get people, for doing the devotionals at night, and I need you to direct or to be a counselor for the 10-year-old boys. I was like, okay. And I loved it. It changed my life. When I came back, we were appointing deacons, and I told them, I said, I will be a deacon, but I want to start up a preteen group. And we did. And it was fantastic. And I went back the next year and did the 10-year-old boys. And then I ended up working my way up to being a co-director and then up to being the director of the preteen camp. But God had a plan for me. I didn't think I was worthy to do it. But He showed me otherwise. I did, and it's changed my life because of that. Moses accepted God's plan even when he didn't think that he was worthy. And of course, we know the story of Moses. He went to Pharaoh. Pharaoh wouldn't give in. 10 plagues. Pharaoh says, okay, fine, take them. Moses led the children of Israel through the Red Sea because it was parted. They went through the Red Sea on dry land. They took them to the promised land. They sent the spies in, remember? They said, nope, the land is inhabited by giants. They brought back a bunch of grapes. You know how you get grapes out of a little bag and it's a bunch of grapes? It was so large that 2 men had to carry that one bunch of grapes on a post between them. See? Look at the fruit. It's so large. The people are humongous. There's no way. They voted, said, nope, we can't do it. And because of that, God said, you know what? You're not worthy to go into the promised land. You go to the desert instead. So here's Moses, who's supposed to lead them out of Egypt, is now going to lead them into the wilderness for 40 years, circling around in the desert, until that generation of the children of Israel that doubted God died. So here's Moses, who had planned a life as a shepherd, is now a shepherd of men. And he deals with them, deals with all their complaining, deals with all their anguish, deals with all their unhappiness. And he finally brings them back. Well, let me back up a little bit. One time they wanted water. We're thirsty. We've got to have water. God told him to go take his staff and strike a rock and water will flow. And Moses was so mad, instead of giving the thanks to God for the water, he got mad at it and struck the rock in anger. And because of that, Moses was denied access to the promised land. So he led the children of Israel back to the river Jordan. Here it is. He got to see it, but he died instead of crossing the river into the promised land. So his whole life was disrupted. His whole life had changed. But that's what God wanted. God knew that he was capable of doing that. So even though we find ourselves not being worthy, God sees something that we don't. So God accepted Moses, even though he thought he was unworthy. The next thing is accept God's plan for you. Don't try to run and hide from God, because you can't. Of course, we're going to talk about Jonah. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for the wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah arose to flee from the presence of the Lord. He went to Tarshish instead. Jonah, I need you to do something. I need you to do something for me. I need you to go to Nineveh and preach, because they're wicked. They need to hear my word. Thanks, Lord, but I don't like them. No, thank you. I'm running the other direction. Did God know where Jonah went? Yep. Got on a boat, got out into the sea. Huge storm came up. Jonah's in the bottom of the ship sleeping. Everybody's on top freaking out because of this huge storm. Somebody's done something. They started lightening the ship, throwing everything overboard. They cast lots. Guess who it fell on? Jonah. They talked to Jonah, and he'd already told them that he was running away from God. You know? And they said, what can we do? Jonah says, you know what? Just toss me overboard. They'll take care of it. They didn't want to, but they decided, okay, fine. They toss him overboard. As soon as he splashes in the water, the storm quits. The water's calm. The crew worshiped God after that, because their gods didn't help them, but Jonah's God did. Jonah's sitting out there peddling water. God says, okay, here comes a ship, or a fish. Swallows Jonah whole. 3 days in the belly of the fish. And you know what that had to be like. It's not like you see on cartoons where there's light, there's a desk floating around and whatever. I can imagine the belly of a fish being like the belly of a fish. Stinky, slimy, dead fish floating around, whatever. Would not be a pleasant sight. Would not be a pleasant experience. Did God want Jonah to have a pleasant experience? No. He defied him. So for 3 days, he's in the belly of this big fish. Jonah gets smart. He prays to God. The fish comes to the beach, vomits him out on dry land. That doesn't even vomit him out on the water so he can at least wash off a little bit. Okay? Then Jonah 3, verses 1 through 3. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you. Do you think Jonah listened this time? Do you think he got the message that God wanted him to do something? Jonah, I have picked you, even though you don't think you're worthy, even though you don't want to do it, I've picked you. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. We might say no to God. We might try to hide, but he knows where we're at. And if he has chosen you to do something, we need to do it. Jonah accepted God's plan for him eventually. God has a plan for the most unlikely person. Is that you? Let's go to the New Testament. Acts chapter 7, verse 58. This is the first time we hear of Saul. And they cast him, being Stephen, out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. Saul was a Jew. Okay? And here they are stoning Stephen for being a Christian. And when we flip over the next page, Acts 8, verse 1 and 3. Now Saul was consenting to the death of Stephen. And at that time a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. Remember, we looked at the map 2 weeks ago about where Judea and Samaria and Galilee were at? Except the apostles. They were not being persecuted. And then drop it down to verse 3. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off the men and women and committing them to prison. So Saul hates Christians so much that he's worked himself up from the ranks, from holding the coats at Stephen's martyr being killed, to having his own men going through the streets, busting down doors, grabbing the men and women who say they're Christians and hauling them off to prison. And he's loving it. He's enjoying it. He wants to do it more. So in Acts 9, verses 1 through 13, then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters for him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, which was Jesus, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So he journeyed, as he journeyed, he came near Damascus. And suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul answered, Who are you, Lord? Then the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? Remember, he believes. He's a Jew. He believes in Jesus, just not this Jesus. Because the Jews wanted the Jesus to come and take an earthly throne and kick the Romans out of Jerusalem so they could get their holy city back. But since this Jesus did not do that, they don't believe in him. But he does believe in God. He does believe that there is going to be a Christ. Lord, what do you want me to do? Then the Lord said to him, Arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. And the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no one. Then Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no one. But they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. And he was 3 days, here we go, 3 days again, without sight, and neither ate nor drank. I inserted this slide. I wasn't planning on talking about Ananias, but Ananias kind of fit into my story. God might want you to carry out the most unlikely plan. Are you ready? Verse 10, Acts 9. Now there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him the Lord said in a vision, knock, 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 Ananias, I got something for you to do. Ananias, and he said, Here I am, Lord. So the Lord said to him, Arise and go to the street called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus. For behold, he is praying, and in a vision he has seen a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him so that he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. Okay? Lord, do you know who this Saul is? Do you know what this Saul is doing to your people? He's dragging them off to prison. I just want to make sure, Lord, that you understand who this Saul is that you want me to go talk to. But the Lord said to him, Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine. God is going to choose the most unlikely people. Here he sees something in Saul, something that he wants on his side. Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles. We've been talking about this in our Sunday morning classes. Kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. Now we all know that Saul changed his name to Paul, and he brought the message of Christ not only to the Gentiles, but the whole region. He ended up writing letters back to the churches that he had created. He went to prison and still wrote letters. He did not let what he used to be stop him from who he now was. God saw something in Saul, and he wanted him on his side. He saw the determination in Saul and knew that determination that once he was converted, he would use to spread the gospel. And the word spreading throughout that region, through the Gentiles, was because of Paul. God saw what he was and wanted him. We can't look at people as we see them and say, you know what, that person doesn't deserve Christ. You know what, he's not going to be, worthy. Let me share a story with you. Just came into my head. When we were in North Carolina, we took the teens to a youth rally in, I can't remember the name of the town now. I think it was Spartanburg, South Carolina. And we had gotten there early, misjudged how long it was going to take us to get there on Friday night. We got there early. We were sitting up on this side of the bell, about maybe 4 or 5 rows back with all the kids. And we were watching just all these people come in. And just before the services started, this biker came in. And I kid you not, a biker. Long hair, big old beard, had the vest on with all the patches on it, had T-shirt, looked like a cigarette's rolled up in it. Your normal, what you would think, biker, change with his wallet and all this. And my thought was, why is he here? They introduced, we sang and all that, and they introduced the speaker. Nobody got up. Everybody's looking around. All of a sudden, this biker stands up, looks around, walks up to the podium, reaches into his pocket, pulls out a little small New Testament, slams it down on the podium. He says, if this is Christianity, it stinks, and I don't want anything to do with it. Come to find out, through the weekend, he was an undercover narcotics agent in downtown Montgomery, or Atlanta, Georgia. And he came in costume, if you will. When he came in on Sunday, he had shaved and had a suit on and, looked what we might consider normal. But he gave the stories of how he has done this in other churches and how they wouldn't even let him in the door. But how many times do we do that? Do we see a person, maybe the way they dress, maybe the way they're acting, and we say, you know what, I'm not going to talk to him. I'll come over here and talk to this person. We stated about that in James, about judging people. We don't bring the person up front who's dressed nicely, but the person in rags, we sit in the back. Ananias is doing this. He's judging Saul because of his past history. Lord, you do know who this is. God said, yes, but he's my chosen vessel. So we got to make sure that we don't do that we don't judge people on who we want to be a Christian. We need to look at it as souls that need to be saved no matter what. Saul was the most unlikely person to spread the message, but he was the right person for the job. God doesn't give us a timeline for when he wants us or for how long. We just need to be ready to say yes. We can't be like Jonah and say no. Our last scripture this morning is going to be in Romans 12, verse 2. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The will of God. We can't go against the will of God. We cannot conform to this world. Remember, we're just passing through this. This world is not our home. Heaven is. That's what we're striving for. And it could be that in our lifetime, God has something for us to do to get us ready, to get somebody else ready. So we don't need to conform to this world. Being conformed in the context of this lesson would be to ignore God and do whatever you wanted to do instead. Whatever makes you happy. Do you not think that Noah was happy sitting in that ark with all those animals for a year? Think about the new responsibilities he had to do every single day to keep them fed and watered. We know Moses wasn't happy all the time leading the children of Israel to the promised land. They did nothing but moan and groan and complain about everything. Do you think Abraham was pleased when God told him to sacrifice his only son? Jonah wasn't happy about going to Nineveh, so he ran in the opposite direction. Saul was made to see the light and change his views about the Christians and became one. So are you ready to renew your mind and to be open and accept whatever it is that God has planned for you? Are you ready for God to call on you? Are you ready and willing to change your life for God? Would you be willing to change your life's plans to do God's will? Want to make God laugh? Tell him your plans. So start exercising and stretching so that you will be ready to bend your life around whatever